Big changes for labor leadership in San Diego. How that's playing out for union politics. Crumbling cliffs in Del Mar, the game plan to stabilize the seaside bluffs and the price tag. Struggling to keep the California dream alive. And are we wired to care about those who've fallen behind? I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, columnist Michael Smolens with the San Diego Union Tribune, investigative reporter Amitha Sharma with KPBS News, and Allison St. John, who covers North County for KPBS News. Well, a chaotic period involving key power brokers within San Diego's labor movement has come to an end. Mickey Kasparian, longtime leader of United Food and Commercial Workers Local 135, was ousted this week. And that means a critical rift among labor, key supporters of local Democrats, is mending. So, Michael, start right there. Who is Mr. Kasparian, and what led to his downfall?
Well, a lot of things led to his downfall. But first, about Mickey Kasparian, you mentioned that he was the longtime leader of the UFCW, but he also, for years, was the head of the San Diego Imperial County's Labor Council. And that's an umbrella organization that most unions in the region belong to, and it's just been a political powerhouse, and he became the political power behind that. So he was one of the most influential political people around, if not the most. So that's where he had been coming from. Now, a lot of things had happened. Most dramatically, he had been accused of sexual harassment, workplace discrimination, and things like that.
Lawsuits arising.
Like, I think 3 lawsuits, and all were settled privately, and he denied all the allegations. And that was within the UFCW, not the Labor Council. So that in itself is enough to usually bring people down. It didn't immediately because of his power. A lot of people were scared to take him on, and that caused big stress within the Democratic Labor Organization. The Labor Council itself ran into a lot of disputes because of that. He was a polarizing figure. He picked sides, and there were fissures. And eventually, there was such disruption that the National AFL-CIO came in to basically put into receivership what they did. He left just before that happened to create his own breakaway organization called the Families Working Council, brought his union and some others. So, as you can see, there was a big rift in labor and so forth, and that has ended. His breakaway group basically started petering out and splitting up. The UFCW just voted him out as president just the other week by a huge margin. So labor leaders and Democratic folks are looking at some healing now.
So is this rift healing? Is it coming together?
Well,
or time will tell.
The new leader of the UFCW says we're going back to the Labor Council. So that's a huge thing right there. I mean, there are going to be differences. You know, organized labor and Democrats, they do tend to fight. They have different interests sometimes. They do get unified, and as they even did in a lot of cases, despite the split in this last election. But I think people are looking to much more harmony and a little tamping down of these rifts.
I guess, beyond the personalities, what was the difference between the two branches of the labor movement? Because he was supporting some more progressive, should we say, candidates in some of the elections, right? So was his arm of the movement more progressive, or was it really nothing to do with policy?
I don't know that you can say that. I mean, a lot of it had to do with personalities, and exactly when he was with the Labor Council and the subsequent organization, some people they made, in retrospect, some wrong choices, some candidates that probably weren't the best people for those campaigns. They might have liked their politics, but they were not going to win. They didn't win. And some people questioned why this was happening and why these choices were being made. And was it what's best for the Democrats and workers, or was it because of sort of personal feuds and vendettas and things like that? So,
and Michael, is there a sense that these various entities, the Democratic Party, the local Democratic Party, and Labor, have learned their lessons on how to handle sexual harassment allegations?
Well, you'd like to think they're still going to come up, and the Democratic Party faced another issue with some internal claims of sexual harassment, and the current leader, Jessica Hayes, the outgoing leader, she said we were just ill-prepared to deal with that. We're volunteer organizations. They didn't really have a process in place. Now she believes they do. So we'll see how that works going forward. But some women, particularly young women,
give us some more specifics on that. That was interesting in your column today.
Amid all this, going on with Mickey Kasparian in April of this year, dozens of mostly young Democratic women activists, signed this letter complaining that there had been claims of sexual harassment within the party ranks that weren't being addressed or even being taken seriously. And that caused a huge issue. You had sort of a generational thing going on, a gender thing going on. And as I said, that part of the problem was they didn't have really a process to deal with that. That's working now, they've got a new committee and people have taken sexual harassment or anti-sexual harassment training. So we'll see. But that became a big issue. And here it was like 7 weeks before the primary election.
I guess what I'm
Allison?
interested in is whether this is going to result in a more influential and effective labor movement in San Diego as a result of this coming together again.
I think so, just because there are always going to be some personality clashes and things, but Mickey Kasparian was such a strong personality, and he was not subtle about how he acted. Whether we see that kind of behavior, again, I don't know. People want to come together, but there are going to be differences. For instance, let's take the emerging San Diego mayor's race. You've got three named Democrats, Barbara Breed, Todd Gloria, and Scott Peters, to varying degrees have good relations with labor. Are all laborers going to get behind one? Probably not. So we'll have to see how that sort of shakes out. So there will be differences, but like I said, I don't think that, at least right now, they're hoping they can avoid the real kind of bitter feuds and splits that they've had in the past.
But do you think there will be an attempt, though, by these various labor groups to get behind one candidate?
It's hard to say. They're treading very lightly right now. They might kind of go a little lightly in the primary and see how that shakes out. It's still early. It's a bit of an embarrassment of riches, but a few labor leaders have told me that it's kind of an uncomfortable one because they don't want to offend anybody, and obviously if they pick the wrong candidate, that can, or the candidate that doesn't win, that can lead to some issues, particularly with the municipal unions, who will have to deal with the mayor they didn't support.
Now, as your column noted today, still things coming out of last month's election look a lot better for Democrats than Republicans at this stage.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess you could sort of look at, despite the problems that the local Democratic labor campaign machine had, or within internally, they had a banner year. There were some problems and so forth. If there's more unity moving ahead, and some people seem to think 2020 the dynamics are even more favorable to Democrats, and that certainly should help them if they're in more unified. And they will be in the fall. I mean, that always happens. People are worried about this infighting, but usually both parties, when they have those kind of divisions during the primary, they tend to fall in line afterwards.
Now, before we leave this topic, I wanted to do kind of a step back question here. How powerful is labor at the local level and even across the country? I mean, if you go back to 1970, for example, or the mid-70s, you had 30% of American workers were unionized. Now that's in the single digits. How big a factor is labor itself politically anyway, and even in San Diego?
Well, I can't speak so much to the national picture other than, yes, the membership certainly has gone down. I think locally, I haven't been tracking the membership, but politically, labor has increased in its power. There was a time, this was a Republican town, and even as the voter registration flipped to favor Democratic voters having more voters being more favorable, the infrastructure, the power structure was still basically run by Republicans. That's changed. The Democratic and labor movement has really figured it out and gotten stronger. And
registration's changed.
Registration has changed. So there's a lot of demographic trends that are working towards their favor with increased minorities and Latinos who seem to be drawn more to the Democratic side than the Republican side for a lot of things that have happened over time. Right. But it has gotten more powerful, and I think that's being reflected in a lot of offices you see, whether the County Board of Supervisors is probably going to become more Democratic. The San Diego City Council has a supermajority of Democrats now, and the next mayor more than likely will be a Democrat.
And before we move on, I did want to have you explain to us who replaced Mickey Kasparian and who's moving into that position, and who knows how big a power broker he will be.
Well, his name's Todd Walter, and he was fired. He was the vice president of UFCW. He was fired because he criticized Mickey Kasparian during this time when these lawsuits were raging and other things were going on. And so he decided to run against him. I think a lot of people were surprised that A, Mickey Kasparian lost, and B, lost by like a 2-to-1 margin. Walter just, he thought that Kasparian had become a distraction. was sucking money out of the organization, not necessarily out of graft or anything, but just the legal fees have become enormous for the UFCW. And he also said, are they spending too much money and time on politics and not concerned about the workers? Now, on the other hand, that he may be new to this. There are negotiations coming up with supermarkets that are really important. So we'll see what kind of leadership he actually provides there. Like I said, he's bringing the UFCW back to the Labor Council. Is he going to be a big power? We'll just have to see. I'm sure that he wants to pay attention initially to what's going on with his union and doing the best for his members.
A lot of things to play out and follow up on as we go along. Fascinating stuff. Well, we're going to move on. The fear is this. Passengers enjoying the seaside train ride through Del Mar could one day find themselves surfing down crumbling bluffs and become part of the scenery. Sections of the ever-eroding sandstone bluffs have crumbled 4 times since August. And the big question, what can be done? And Allison, start there. What are the specifics on what's happened in these recent slides?
Well, I was actually on the train when...
You didn't go down the beach, did you?
I didn't, but I discovered that I was wondering, am I going to get home again? The day that the 4th slide happened, there's just one spot on that very 2-mile stretch in Del Mar where the train goes rumbling by. And if you've ever ridden that line, it's really quite, it's quite arresting. You look out the window and you can just see the edges, just feet from the edge of from the train. So basically it was the 4th slide, and they did reckon that several feet fell. And if you saw the photographs, it wasn't actually quite as bad as the photographs were suggesting. Turns out it was on the other side of a berm that's between the railway line and the beach. And so the back side next to the beach crumbled, lost about 6 feet, which is a lot, because on average that bluff loses about 6 inches a year. However, it never depends. It depends on the weather. So it's never 6 inches a year. It could be 6 feet one year and nothing the next year. So this was a particularly bad slide.
And what are the experts saying is causing these particular slides here?
Well, it's interesting. You'd think that there's 50 trains a day. This is the second most used intercity railway line in the country. 50 trains a day.
That's remarkable. I read that in your story. Yeah.
And so you'd think that them rumbling down the cliffs would make a difference. But according to Sandag, they've done studies, and it's not trains rumbling along. It is the sand being eroded from the bottom, which of course is speeded up by climate change. And then it's the rain and the irrigation from all the Del Mar gardens that's pouring over the cliffs that is causing the erosion. That, combined with the fact that, of course, surfers and dog walkers walk along those cliffs all the time, which deters the undergrowth, the shrubs, from growing, and weakens the cliffs as well.
Well, and you don't have to be an expert. You walk along the beach, you just look at that, and they just don't look all that stable up and down that stretch of coach.
I have walked those cliffs since 2002,
yes,
and almost every day. I lived a block away from there, and I have seen the upper cliff, which is right above where the train goes in Del Mar. I have seen that pathway to walk narrow significantly over the years, to the point where at one point there was a bench and a big piece of shrubbery that had been on the cliff that was now the cliff. It was part of the cliff. It was perpendicular.
Yeah.
And there's so many parts of the lower cliff where, it's just narrowed so much that now I don't even walk over there. I walk on the beach in Del Mar.
That's a very
just
wise
north
solution.
of there, because I just don't feel comfortable. Even to walk on the beach along the cliffs seems very precarious.
I would recommend that people walking along the beach do stay a long distance away from those cliffs. They're not stable.
I want to get back to something you said a moment ago about how busy this is. We do have a soundbite here, official from the San Diego Association of Governments. Set that up for us.
About how busy the line is?
Yeah, that's Jim Linthicum.
Oh, Linthicum, Sandag, yes. Yeah. Yes, no, I mean, he's making the point that this is not just a few people traveling up and down the coast.
So let's hear him, and then I got a question off of this from you. For you.
But that is the only north-south rail line that connects us. That's the second busiest intercity rail corridor in the country. And so a lot of people depend on that. It's not just commuters, but it's also Amtrak going, points north, and also the freight train. So it would be a pretty significant impact to everyone.
And the thing is, I mean, it's a key part of that whole north-south corridor. We're expanding I-5, there's new lanes being added for the cars, but we all know that we have to get out of our cars. So the train is a really good alternative, and it is becoming more popular. I mean, I travel on it quite regularly, and it's definitely getting quite crowded, which is a good thing. But this 2-mile stretch is like a vulnerable weak link in the chain, because if that goes, everything from LA to San Diego would be threatened.
So this is Amtrak. It means the feds. I mean, we could get some Fed money to get involved with this. And you were about to ask my question.
I was going to say that the larger issue here is, and Allison mentioned it, I mean, the whole climate change sea rise is something that, I mean, you look at what's going on in Imperial Beach, more and more flooding. It's always had issues, but it's just happening more regularly with the higher tides. And eventually, I mean, they can shore that up, but short of building almost its own separate structure, are they going to have to
and the
move?
Coastal Commission would not like that.
Yeah, somehow move the rail line inland, and there's not a lot of property to do that. So just all along the coast, I think you're going to see issues like this. And again, this isn't just a climate change thing, but sea level rise is just going to be a hugely expensive and disruptive situation over a long period of time.
Right, so what are they talking about and how much money are we talking
Speaking of hugely expensive, so they're looking at the fact that when it goes, what is the alternative? Nobody's thinking about anything right now except tunneling under Del Mar. And there's, 5 different proposed routes that they could do it. They've made an estimate, and in 2018 dollars, it would be $3.5 billion. That's a lot of money. I'm kind of interested in the fact that nobody is talking about whether it would be actually cheaper for the public. And of course, this is a very unpopular solution, but to use eminent domain. If this is such an important part of our transit route, there are a lot of extremely nice houses that would probably cost millions, but it might be cheaper to buy those homes and build a much more, well-established train line somewhere along the coast there than to try tunneling under Del Mar. However, at the moment, the issue is stabilize those cliffs until we can get $3.5 billion.
But what's the timeline? I mean, what if the situation
That's the
worsens?
key question. That's the key question. And people at Scripps Institution of Oceanography have been studying those cliffs, and I asked them, if you were going to give your well-informed decision as to how long these cliffs would last, he said he couldn't do it, but that he would say it would be a matter of decades. So maybe 1 or 2 decades. Not longer than that. So, I mean, it's not a lot of time to raise that level of money.
And they're shoring up with walls now and barriers.
Well, actually, it's interesting. What they have now is this system, which the Coastal Commission likes, of putting these soldier piles, concrete piles up to 60 feet down that you can't see because they're buried in the cliffs. So they're actually strengthening the railway line quite effectively without being visible. And they've now got about another $2.5 million or so to do some fairly minor stuff next year to try to revegetate the cliffs. But they've estimated it'll cost about $90 million to stabilize the cliffs. So even if they're not talking about the tunnel, this is a lot of public money when, San Diego is looking for money to do all the many things we want to keep San Diego moving. Just to keep that 2-mile stretch of rail line is quite a big investment.
It could be temporary, as we say. Well, that's another fascinating thing to follow up on and see what happens going forward. And it's not just the trains, it's the homes there and everything else, as Michael says, along the shoreline all the way from the border on north.
It's such a beautiful piece of the train line, I think we would miss it if it disappeared, but it is very vulnerable.
You don't want to be on the train when the music stops, that's for sure.
Yes.
All right, we're going to move on. Winners get a lot of attention in our society, always have. We have been aggressive capitalists, after all, since the dawn of the Republic. But what about those who, for whatever reasons, cannot or will not compete? Most obvious are the homeless. They present an ever-present challenge for our society. For many, it's what to do, how to help. But for some, it's, well, why should I care? And Amitha, that was an original, interesting story that you had exploring the notion of empathy, and it was inspired by some interviews you had with some citizens. Start there. Tell us about those interviews.
Right. So a year and a half ago, I did a story about violence against the homeless, and I spoke to a homeless woman in her early 60s in downtown San Diego. Her name was Cheryl Taylor, and she wore these pink bunny ears. And she had a little lawn chair that she was sitting on across the street from a high-rise. And she said in the evenings, people would go out to the balcony of those high-rises and yell at her and say, trash, garbage, why don't you bum, why don't you get out of here? And she said, none of those people have ever come down to speak to me and ask me how I got here. And she had a very sad story. She was working as an in-home caregiver. Her daughter, 28-year-old daughter, started having epileptic seizures. She had to quit her job to stay home. She didn't have a financial buffer. They got evicted from their apartment, and that's how she ended up.
The common story in our society. Medical crisis causes
there are a lot of people who've been evicted
yeah.
who have landed on the streets. And then earlier this year, I interviewed a man by the name of Chad Bordis, and he had an MBA. He was working 3 jobs, 16 hours a day, driving Uber, Lyft, and working for an online car sales company. He was living in his car. And He was very, understandably so, demoralized, frustrated, and a little befuddled, and this is what he asked.
Yeah, a soundbite from him.
How do we get here? You know, how do we get to a point where we devalue human life? You know, to where, you know, it's okay if we step over homeless people, or, you know, if you're sleeping in your car, it doesn't matter.
So this got you thinking about empathy, and there's biology behind this, as you discovered.
There is biology behind it. And I prefaced all of this by, you know, I understand that we as a society are displaying empathy. There are tons of people, paramedics, police officers, politicians, who are very concerned.
This time of year, a lot of people giving.
They volunteer, they help.
Yeah, donate.
And I understand all that. And I understand, you know, some of the problems that come with homelessness within neighborhoods and why people don't want the homeless there. High crime, property values go down. So I understand all that. Putting that all aside, I wanted to know what our collective capacity was for empathy. So I spoke with a couple of people from UCSD. One of the gentlemen was an MD and neuroscientist by the name of Dr. William Mobley. And he said that empathy is as native to us, to humans, as sight, touch, hearing, all of that. And so, you know, it's in our nature to be empathetic. We're wired for it, and we've had it since the dawn of time. When we were living in tribes, we absolutely needed empathy to read one another and for our survival.
Well, we've got a comment from him too. Let's hear a little of that.
Because empathy changes everything. It changes my relationship to my world to me. It changes the way I live my life. It absolutely prevents me from ignoring or diminishing the value of another human being. You know, everybody I know is of immense value. Empathy helps me understand that. And if everybody's of immense value, how can I ignore anybody in suffering? And if I can't ignore anybody who's suffering, well, then the world just changes.
And I should add, one important point that Dr. Mobley made was that the parts of the brain, you can actually see this on imaging, the parts of the brain that get activated when you feel like you're in pain or you're distressed or you're surprised, that also gets activated when you see someone else in that same state, or at least there's overlap there in those parts of the brain. And so that's how we know that we have this innate nature of empathy.
So if we see the homeless on the street, and of course we've all encountered it, we live in a big city and talk many times in this show about the chronic problem here and across California and the country. What about those, if we're supposedly wired for this, what about those who lack empathy? And of course, your first interview, you said that woman encounters that all the time.
Well, I think according to some of the experts I've spoken to, people are tired, they're desensitized, they're super, super busy. The biggest challenge to empathy is pressure. And all of us feel like we're under pressure. And I think that there's a level of helplessness too. You know, I look out and I see this massive problem. And I think I alone can't do anything to resolve it. I spoke to another woman from Northern California, and she said, you know, babies have an empathic muscle. We all have that. And for some reason, the way we live in our society, the complexity of our society, the pressure of our society weakens that empathic muscle. I spoke with a neuropsychiatrist at UC San Diego. His name is Dr. Dilip Jeste. And I asked him, can we improve our empathy? Can we develop it? And he said, well, you know, empathy is genetic, just like resilience is, just like optimism is. It's part of our personality traits. So 35 to 50% of it is inherited, but that means that, you know, another 50% can be developed, can be improved. And there's a lot of research around meditation, specifically loving kindness meditation, where, you know, you say every morning or every day, I am healthy, I am happy, I am at peace. Then you say the same thing for your family, for your friends, for your loved ones, then you say the same thing for complete strangers, and here's the key. You also say it for your enemies, people who have done you wrong. And Dr. Juste, as well as a lot of other scientists, say that they have shown, this kind of practice has shown to improve empathy, and so does keeping a gratitude journal.
Seems odd in our polarized political time here, where it's such a common thing to demonize others and point the finger at people and get political mileage out of that.
I also feel like that perhaps because one of the issues when you're looking at folks on the streets, like your stories are profiling, you know, we live in such different realities. We assume that our own reality is the reality. But there are so many other people living in completely different realities. And so how to open oneself to the possibility that this other person that you're confronting is actually living in a very different sort of a world?
Well, there are a couple of things, you know.
Make it one thing. We're almost out of time.
Okay. The one thing is how do we talk about it? You know, I interviewed the mayor in Riverside, Rusty Bailey, and he does not call people living on the streets homeless people in Riverside. He calls them our neighbors without homes.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up and look at our neighbors and follow it up with another story. It's fascinating stuff, though. But that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Michael Smollens of the Union Tribune, Amitha Sharma of KPBS, and Allison St. John, also of KPBS. Reminder, all the stories we discussed today on our website. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us at the Roundtable.